We have done 5 classes already, and so we are now familiar with all the threads, all the strings that have been presented in a loose form, and now it's time to weave them together and really talk about gardening. So let's get into it. And so, little disclaimer right off the top, as I talk about what I consider the best practices from my point of view. And these are the ways I've done things in the garden and has worked for my context and my goals. But I want to acknowledge that with gardening, I think gardening is kind of cool because it is like this intersection between science and art. Yep. So it's kind of where art and science kind of come together. And so there's many different ways of having success in the garden. And so, yeah, a little disclaimer, if I say something about how I do things and what I recommend doing, and it doesn't exactly follow the same advice you got from your sweet old grandma, I'm not telling you that your grandma is wrong. It's perfectly possible that is the right way of doing things as well. But this is just as what has worked for me. And so if anything that comes up where I'm talking about how I've had things that I've done and how I've had success with them, if you're familiar of a different way of doing it, please feel free to share those. Like at this point, we just want to have a productive dialogue together. And yeah, so please feel free to share if you have a different way of doing things. There's not necessarily a right way or a wrong way. Yeah, so disclaimer aside, your grandma's really sweet. I'm not telling you that she's doing gardening wrong. So my first advice right off the bat is I really recommend starting your own little garden journal. And you can use that journal to record observations. And you might feel awkward writing down observations in this garden journal at the beginning because you're not really sure what you're supposed to be looking for, although hopefully this class helped sort of point you in the right direction. But as those observations accumulate over time, our memories, we like to think our memories are perfect, but not quite so in reality. So it's nice to have something recorded there, and you might come back to it and make a really important connection between an earlier observation and one of your latest observations. So really recommend starting your own little journaling system. Now I'm going to start off this class by talking about seed starting, and I need to differentiate between 2 different ways of starting seeds. There's transplanting and direct seeding. The first series of slides is going to be transplanting, and then I'm going to talk about direct seeding afterwards. So please be aware of the distinction there. So transplanting is to start seeds in a container, most often done in a heated indoors, and letting them get established in those containers before we put them out into their eventual space in the garden or a bigger container where they're going to reach their harvesting maturity stage. So the advantage of doing that with transplanting is that we have a very short growing season here in the Bow Valley, and the springtime can be quite cool. So the ability to start seeds indoors and let them grow to the appropriate maturity and size before putting them outdoors is a huge advantage that has allowed myself over the years to grow a lot more food than I would have if I was just direct seeding it. And then the other, yeah. So then I'll talk about succession planting. You'll see what I mean by that when we get to the crop reference charts. And then it's also an advantage to start your seeds transplanting because it's more efficient use of water. in these trays. I mean, I start my seeds in trays like this, which are, this is a 72 insert or cell tray. And so you can start 72 plants in a 11 by 22 inches space. So save a lot of money, or you save a lot of water in that sense. And then obviously direct seeding is to directly seed and grow plants in soil, and they spend their entire life cycle or life cycles in that one container. But we can't, sometimes it'd be nice to get that temporal advantage on the growing season by starting them in transplant trays. But as we'll see, there are some of those tap-rooted sensitive crops that they do not like being handled whatsoever. So if we were to try to transplant them, the stress that they would feel from that would be overwhelming for them, and they wouldn't be productive plants. So we have to direct seed them. And then there's a lot of other directly seeded plants, crops that are just so planted so densely. It would take up so much space in our indoor starting areas that it's just not feasible. So that's the difference there. And so with that in mind, this is a direct seeded, no, this is the transplant reference crop sheet. And this comes out of the book that I have. This is actually, like, look at the condition this book is in. That's how much I've used it over the years. And this is the second copy of this book I ever had. The first one I gave to my friend in Nicaragua. So that's how useful this is. And so some people might look at this reference chart and get overwhelmed off of it from the start. But running a good garden, a productive garden, is all about understanding how to use the right tool for the right job. And this reference chart is one of the best tools that I have in order to plan out the garden and to get a good idea of how things are going to go through the year. So I'll just explain that. I'm going to get my red laser pointer out. And so obviously this is our first column here, and that has all the transplanted crops. So there's another chart I'll talk about that's direct seeded, but these are all crops that are good for transplanting. The next one is the family that they belong to, and this will come into factor when we talk about crop rotation. But we're already seeing, if I had more time in an earlier class to talk about the battles of taxonomy that have happened over the years, there's some of these that are outdated. But so this says umbel, it says celery and carrots and dill. They're all in the umbel family, but that's been updated. If you see that they're currently updated to be known as the Apiaceae family. It's confusing, I know, but you have to try to work through that terminology. But anyways, these will become important in time when I talk about crop rotations. And then DTM up here refers to days to maturity. And so these days going down here, that's how many days in perfect situations it would take for these crops to get to the harvesting stage once you transplant them out into the garden. You'll notice that they're all in multiples of 7. And so that is because for planning purposes, it's easier to just say, you know, it's going to be ready within this many weeks. You know, so when you see 28, that's really saying 4 weeks. But anyways, so this is really helpful in terms of planning. If you were to have uh, lettuce in at the start of the season, if that was the first thing that you planted in a section, then you would know that when you planted it, if it's the spring, it might take 42 days to get to maturity, maybe 49, but you have a better picture of how long it'll take to get ready, and you can be prepared to have lettuce on your menu that week, or you can be prepared to know that you're going to you're going to make the most of the space you have in your garden. If you're going to harvest that and turn it over, then you're already ready with the next set of transplanted crops to go into that, and you don't waste any time trying to think about that next step. Planting frequency is kind of what you would think about how often you would start these throughout a season in order to have a continuous supply. So this can be helpful as well. And then these next three refer to the best density from which you can plant all of these crops. So maybe you can't read that. Maybe my picture isn't that clear, but that says rows per bed. So this book operates off of the standard bed width being between 24 inches and 30 inches wide. And so what they're saying right here is that if you have a standard bed width, like 24 to 30 inches wide, then this is how many rows you would be able to fit in that standard bed away from each other. Any closer and the root competition would affect the productivity of the plants. Any further away from each other, and it wouldn't be the most efficient use of space. So these farmers have been keeping track of these densities and their production that they got out of those densities for many years, and this is generally speaking a good guideline to follow for how far apart the rows should be. And then these next two rows are showing these next two columns are showing how close within the rows that you plant that the transplants should go together. So this is how far apart the rows are. These, depending on if you want to be imperial or metric, tell you how far apart in the rows the density should be. So if you see 0.03, that's 30 centimeters. If you see 0.45, that's 45 centimeters. So very, very useful tool, help people understand what the most efficient density of your plantings can be.
Christian, can we grab the name of that book, please?
Yeah. It's called Crop Planting Guide for Organic Vegetable Growers. And yeah, like I said, this is a great tool. And I know maybe some people out there are like, well, I'm not an organic vegetable producer. I don't have a farm. I just have like a little garden. But we can try to glean some of this information and adapt it into our context so that it works for us. And that's why I think I can explain to you guys. And so this next two columns, and again, they're split up on imperial or metric. They show you how much you can expect to harvest from each one of these crops if they're planted at this density and if everything goes well. So this is very, very valuable information. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to new gardeners and they tell me about how much success they had in this first year, and they had so much fun, but they didn't realize how much the garden would produce for them. And they tell me these stories about how they had to give away lettuce to their neighbors. And, so These columns can be very useful if you look at them and kind of understand how much food you or your family or friends are going to consume on a weekly basis, or whatever the period that in the period that they would be ready, when they would become mature with the days of maturity. You should be able to look at this and start to get a good idea that, okay, if I were to plant 1 standard bed meter of lettuce per week, I would get 3.3 heads of lettuce. And my family doesn't eat that much salad every week. So maybe you would just go half a meter. And by saving that half meter, then you can fit in some Swiss chard or some kale or some other really valuable crop that will produce for you, and you won't be exposed to potential food waste. So just something to go through. Some of these aren't perfect, I gotta admit, like the cucumbers. If you look at that yield per meter, it says 13 fruit, and that's referring to generally how many fruit you would get over that 4-week period where it's producing. So it'd be a little bit of a learning curve, I'm sure, for everybody on how to use these, but every tool that you use in the garden kind of feels a little clumsy the first time you have it in your hand. But the more you use it, you get more comfortable and you get that feedback from what's going on, and you'll get better at it each time. The next one over here, potential profitability per acre. Now that obviously that can't apply to us as home gardeners, right? That's ridiculous. But maybe it can, because the crops that are rated as high potential profitability, those are the crops that cost more at market. So from your point of view, you would want to grow something that's more highly profitable, because that's going to save you from going to the market, and it's going to save your pocketbook a little bit that way. They also tend to be better consistent producers and produce at a higher level. So they're favorable in that sense. Yeah, so it's kind of good to kind of look at that. But there can be, you can have your own like personal goals. You can look at some things like melon. You might really like melon. It's a cheaper thing to buy at a grocery store. It's not that great in our climate, so that's not that great. But if you really like melon, then screw this reference chart. You can do whatever you want. Just know that it might be a little bit more work, or more information for everybody. And then this next column is very, very useful for our current conversation right here. This says greenhouse days up here. So these numbers, this is how many days that these seedlings, once they germinate, this is how many days those seedlings can stay in the tray size. This next column refers to tray size. And I showed you my 72 insert right here. And so you can see all the crops that are recommended for 72 cell trays. And then I also have it as an example. This is a 50 cell tray. So there's corn, eggplant. These tend to be seeds that are bigger and grow faster. And so because this is 50 rather than 72, there's a little bit more volume for the roots to grow out into before they start to hit those sides, start to feel that constriction in the root system and start to stress. But so the greenhouse days and the tray size are highly related to each other. If you plant in the suggested tray sizes, then this is that you have as an advantage to start growing indoors or in those containers before they need to be potted up or transplanted out. I'll explain those terms, but So very, very helpful. Like I said before, if you were to if you were to try to get succession crop your garden, if you want to maximize the amount of space, then you could start off in the spring by getting a crop of lettuce, which you would start indoors. Let's say you wanted to plant it out at the start of May. Then you would look at that. You go like, okay, if I want to put that lettuce out into my garden at the start of May, then I know about 28 to 42 days of greenhouse days. That means I could start that lettuce indoors in a tray next week and have them growing on. And then I can plant them out at the start of May. And at that point, with my days to maturity, I know that I have, about a month and a half before it's going to be mature, and I'm going to have space in the garden that I could replace with, let's go with Swiss chard. And so once you know the greenhouse days for that, and you know the date for when the lettuce is about to be ready to harvest, then you know that basically the same time you would be transplanting out that lettuce, you could start a tray of Swiss chard indoors. And when you harvest that lettuce, then you're popping in that Swiss chard right after, and you're just hit the ground running, and you're not wasting any time. Short growing season here in the Bow Valley. And so that's how you can really make the most of your available space and produce as much as you can. Then this last two rows here, this is seeds per cell. I'll explain that when I get to the right slide, but we're just gonna make a note of that. I hope people can read these headers up here, but if not, that says seeds per cell. And then the last one, again, I'll refer to this later when it comes up. This is seeds per gram. So that's how many seeds of each one of those crops weighs per gram. But we'll get there. Any questions about
that? We got a question from Bridget. Seed packets typically list row spacing and seed spacing. Does this reference chart tend to correspond to what it says on seed packets?
It tends to, yeah. There can be different recommendations, yeah. So there's never going to be perfect same information everywhere. But again, I'd say that's where the value of keeping a garden journal is. You can play with those spacing and densities, and if you're keeping track of that in your journal, then you can compare how productive they were to each other and come to your own conclusion on what you feel the best density is.
And then, we got more. Can you email us that chart?
So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that'll be that chart. There'll be a couple charts that are included in the next email.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the resources from the last session I'll send out in that next email too. And then we've got a question from Mary. Can carrots be transplanted?
I mean, they fall under, they're a sensitive taproot crop, so it's difficult to transplant them. And then they're a crop that is really close. They're planted in such density that it makes it challenging as well. And I mean, consider my context when I say that. I would plant a full standard bed for me is 25 feet long and 2 feet wide. So like, I would have to start to fill that space for transplanting would make sense. Whereas if you have a little plot, then it might be different. The one person, this is wonderful gardener in town, Joanne, who told me that she does transplant carrots. And I was like, how do you do it? Like their taproot is so sensitive. And she told me that she starts them in old toilet paper rolls, or cut up like in half paper towel rolls. And so she puts the whole, rather than disturbing that sensitive root, she starts them in there and she pops them in the ground like that. And eventually, because carrots are tap rooted going straight down and not fibrous going out sideways, the cardboard there doesn't it won't degrade really. I'm going to talk about that later, but it doesn't cause a problem. So if you want to do that, that's the best idea I've heard in terms of transplanting carrots. Good. Okay. Oh yeah, that was the next slide. So I wanted to take just one slide to talk about. Again, this is your home gardener's kind of it's your choice here, but I've found that sometimes when we start gardening, we want to just find free materials, and we find all these different size containers, and we're like, oh, it was free, you know, I'm getting started, this is great. But they're not. You just consider the value of investing in some of this kind of thing, the standardized seed trays, from the standpoint that when you're done with them, they're much easier to store efficiently, rather than all these different sizes. Like, what do you do with all that, you know? And so, yeah, so just something to consider there. But again, it's your context. You can make the decision. I just think, yeah, it makes sense to use those from that point of view, and from the point of view, if you have all these different size containers that you're starting in, then you can run into issues with consistency and dealing with those greenhouse days. Everything's, when you don't have that consistency, it makes planning and carrying out that plan a little bit more challenging. But again, your call. And then there's these other do-it-at-home kind of tricks. You make like origami newspaper seedling pots, and or you use an eggshell container, and I think they can work. But I think because the container itself, the newspaper or the cardboard is absorbent itself, I've found that the seedlings, when you're starting them, it dries out the soil medium faster, and you can run into issues of not being able to water them enough in that way. So something to consider. And then I see people on the internet saying that you can just plant the egg carton cardboard down into the soil and it'll biodegrade, which it will, but I don't think it, in my opinion, I just don't see how it degrades fast enough for those roots to make it through. Poke holes right before you put it in order to help those roots shoot through. Otherwise, they could become root bound. I don't know if anybody has any personal experience with that. Let me know, because to be honest, I guess I'm biased because I have always used these standardized plastic trays. No objections? Okay. And then before starting your seeds, I really recommend just doing a little bit of research on them. It can be helpful just knowing some of this basic stuff. Where I'm going to go over this in future slides here coming up shortly. But there is some value to knowing how many days it takes for them to germinate, and before you start looking into the soil temperature that they germinate best at. I've had, so like for celery, if this was celery up here, it takes around 21 days for those seeds to germinate. Parsley takes a while. And I've had discussions with gardeners who have told me like they started these celery and they didn't come up, so they must all be duds, and they just stopped watering them. And I was like, okay, but they have like a long germination period. And so sometimes you can just give up before realizing that that's just the nature of them. And so I have this picture of the West Coast Seeds seed catalog, because if you're looking for helpful information like this, I just really recommend the seed websites. Along with the back of the packages, the seed websites will have a lot of really good information to help you make more educated decisions. They want you to have success so that you keep buying their seeds. So they'll have all sorts of growing tips and starting tips on anything that you're interested. It's not just West Coast Seeds. Johnny Seeds has a lot of really good resources for gardeners to do a little bit of research before they start planting. Otherwise, it kind of becomes a little bit of a game of throwing darts in the dark. If you don't know a little bit about each unique crop that you're trying to grow, then it just makes stuff tough, and sometimes that disheartens people and they think they don't have a green thumb. And you do have a green thumb. You have to do a little bit of research and see how each one of these plant species are just a little different. All right, so when we go to start our seeds, one of the most important things to remember is that at this stage of being a tiny little seed, they don't have a root system, and so moisture is a very important thing. You cannot let, or your germination consistency is going to be a lot lower if you let that soil medium dry out at any point. When it starts to get those signals of it's found the right conditions, so you've been watering it the first couple days, and that seed coat and the little seed embryo inside decides they finally found the right conditions, and they start to sprout, and they only have a tiny little root system, and then you forget about it for one day in the sun, and the whole soil medium dries out. They're going to die. So making sure that your soil medium does not dry out is one of the most common mistakes that I've seen new gardeners make. I know it's a lot of work. I'm going to explain how to make it easier. And then on the other side of it, you don't want the soil medium to be sitting in a puddle either. You don't want swampy conditions for your seeds. When the soil medium is too boggy, then we've talked about several times about anaerobic conditions, and so if there's not enough oxygen in your soil, then that's going to harm the plant, and that's going to stifle germination, and it's going to create disease. I'll talk more about this down the road. That's called dampening off. That's from overwatering your seedlings. So there is a seed starting mix that I recommend in order to make your life easier from the moisture point of view. So one thing I like to add, and actually this ratio here that I make is 3 parts peat moss, 3 parts compost to 1 part perlite. And so perlite is, when I was growing up, it used to like totally punch me in the mind. I didn't understand why people put styrofoam in potting mixes, because that's what perlite looked like to me. It was like these little white bits in the soil. And I mean, if you feel it, it's very light and fluffy. It kind of feels like styrofoam too. But perlite is actually a volcanic, and it's heated up and expanded, and it kind of pops like popcorn. So you take a porous rock and you make all these kind of micro kind of air pockets in it. And so that's what I like to add into my seed starting mixes. in order to, like I said, like watering those germinating seeds is so important. You don't want to let them dry out, but a lot of people are afraid to overwater, and so adding perlite is like, we have busy lives, and so we can't be around our seeds when they're starting all the time. And so if we're going to be away for an entire afternoon from our seedlings, then we might have to overwater a little bit. And so perlite is our fail safe there, because of those, all those tiny little holes, all those air pockets. It helps keep oxygen in the system when we're not managing it perfectly. So that's why we have perlite in our seed starting mixture, is to keep that oxygen in there. And then on the other side, we'll talk about that peat moss or coconut coir. These are really, really absorbent materials. I think I recall peat moss can hold 40 times its own weight in water. And so that's why it's a valuable thing to put into your seed starting mix, because it is basically this giant sponge. And again, if you're busy one afternoon and you can't be there to look after your seedlings, then if you give them a good water, maybe even an overwater, knowing that you got that perlite in there, then that peat moss is going to keep that medium nice and wet, and it won't dry out as fast as it otherwise would be. There's a sustainability debate between these two inputs that you would use. Some people say that our peat moss industries are harvesting them faster than they can grow back naturally. That is definitely the case in Europe. There's a very nuanced debate about that in Canada, of whether we're over harvesting them or not, but it's just something that you can be aware of and do your own research and come up with. But a lot of people might want to stay away from peat moss, and so they'll go with coconut coir, which is nice because it's like an agricultural waste product. So it's a very absorbent, and it's renewable. But then how sustainable is it for us to ship coconut coir from the other hemispheres of the earth? So I don't know. It's a toss up there. But this is really the only place in my gardening operation that I was using these. So it's not, it's your call. Let me know what you think about it if you like. And then the other portion of the seed starting mix that I like to use is a really, really good compost. We talked for 2 hours last class about how awesome the microbes in soil are, and how they can protect from disease, and how they make nutrients available. So I don't think I need to go on more about that. We add this for the nutritional benefits and for the microbial relationships that they provide all these ecosystem services for. Any questions? Sweet. You can buy a pre-mixed version of this if you like. I've always mixed it myself. I don't know. Maybe I didn't have to do that, but I've always done it myself. 3 parts of one of these, 3 parts of compost, and 1 part of that. Mix it all up really good. If there's any big chunks, actually, I will say for compost, I would watch out as a consumer. I find the bag compost that you buy at the garden centers around town here, that bag compost, it has a lot of bigger woody chunks in it, and I don't really like using that compost, because especially in a seed starting mix, you want to avoid like the big chunks, because if you have a big chunk covering your seed, then it's going to be harder for that to merge over. So if I do have to use one of those bag composts early in the season when it's hard for me to get another source of compost, then I'll screen it out, or like try to make sure that those bigger, chunkier things aren't going to hinder the germination. And then we've talked about, in previous class, we talked about these seed dormancy breaking strategies. And so what you just need to understand about starting seeds indoors is that some seeds like your tomatoes or your melon or your cucumbers, those are originating from warmer places in the world. And so you have to supplement a nice gentle heat to warm up that soil before they're going to germinate in any consistent kind of manner. My favorite tool for this is they're called hydrofoam seed heating mats. You can buy them. You can buy one that is big enough to start. It'll go underneath one tray. You can buy those at Canadian Tire or Home Hardware or any garden center around town. They're about $20, $25. So they're really good. They just give the perfect amount of heat for those certain crops that need that heat. And if you're wondering, well, which crop needs heat and which one doesn't, again, the seed websites will generally give you that information, but you can also just Google really quickly germination temperature required for tomato or germination temperature required for spinach, and it'll spit that out really quickly. It's really easy. Yeah, so some things need more heat, and some are very, very cold hardy, like your peas and spinach. They can germinate at very, very low temperatures. Yeah, but yeah, this is just another example. This is a tiny little bit of information that I've found. New gardeners have sort of complained to me that they don't have a green thumb because they started 100 tomato seeds, or they tried to, and only 2 came up. And if they just knew that little bit of information, you'd have a lot more success. If you don't want to spend the $20, $25 on a seed heating mat, a couple lower, more economical choices would be to put it on top of your fridge. Because the heat from the motor of the fridge generally makes that one of the warmer places in your house. Or a water heater, the room for your water heater, although you're generally not going to have access to light in there, but that's an option. And then you could also, if you have a nice south-facing window and it warms up really nicely during these early spring, late winter days, then you can still have quite a bit of success because of that heat that they receive in that south-facing window. But if the germination percentage isn't what it says on the packet, then maybe it's because you tried to save 20 bucks.
Jack had asked, so room temp in a house is not enough, but I think you elaborated on that. Did Christian answer your question, Zach? Jack? Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, they can be enough, but yeah, if you want to get that really high consistent germination, then looking up for each specific seed that you're looking to start, what the optimal temperature is, and making the adjustment within your management scheme is what I would recommend. And we talked about this a little bit, seedlings at this early cotyledon stage when they only have 2 little leaves collecting all the light that they need, and they're running out of the last energy that their parent plant stored for them. They need a lot of light. And if they don't feel like they're getting enough light, which is generally around 14 to 16 hours of light per day at this stage, then they get leggy. So my preferred setup that I've used for this is when I need to supplement extra light in the late winter. Right now we're at if you have a south facing window, we're at the stage of the year where we're getting enough light and they won't get light. Found that anytime before March 15th, you'll want to supplement some light. And so the setup that has worked for me is I would have one of these light timers that you can buy. They're around $12 to $15 at again, any garden center or any home center. And you just kind of like pull out the prongs on it on the right hours that you want to supplement more light. So maybe a couple hours extra in the morning, couple hours extra in the evening. And if you have a south facing window that's gaining all the rest of that light, then that should be sufficient. And so the automatic timer, you just plug lights into it and that'll turn the lights on and off for you. It's quite nice, one less thing to worry about. And then the lights that I like to supplement for, although I'm not saying that's the only product out on the market that'll work for you, is a brand called Sun Blasters. So you can find them on West Coast Seeds, and there's a couple kind of specialty garden centers in Calgary, and I'll bet the garden center on Bow Valley Trail probably has those in stock. So yeah, if you have like an east facing window that doesn't get full sun the way a south facing window does, or anything like that, a little bit of investment into lights like that is what I recommend. And then also consider the nature of the albedo effect as well. If you can create like a white background around your seedlings and increase the reflectivity of that light that's coming into your room, then that's a sort of a lower budget solution to achieving the light needs that you need, is just increasing that albedo effect.
Jack?
Good question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned like with the lights, you know, the timers and stuff. Does that apply to temperature as well? Like, should the temperature for when you plant the seeds, you know, I just looked up tomatoes and 25 degrees is what optimum. Should it be 24 hours a day? Or should it just be 25 for 15, 16 hours a day when it's really warm in front of because I'm getting lots of sunlight?
I have always had them on 24/7,
Okay.
the heater mats.
Okay, I was wondering about that.
Yeah. And I guess I should make a distinction. The heat mats are what I would use as soon as I see like 3/4 germination in one of those trays, or like most of the seeds have started to germinate. I would take the trays off of the heat, and the whole time that the seeds haven't germinated, they're in the process of germinating, but they haven't sprouted up out of the soil, I would not use the lights whatsoever. But as soon as I do see some germination, I would get the lights on and start getting them that extra light. So just having some awareness of that days to maturity can be valuable, because if you plant them on a Monday and they're supposed to germinate in around 5 days, then by the 5th day or the 4th day, you should have a little bit of an extra eye on that seed tray to make sure a couple of them haven't sprouted up and you don't have the lights on and they're already leggy. They'll shoot up really quickly like that. So how deep would you say we should plant a seed? Does anybody know how deep seeds should be planted?
Brooke says twice its size.
Oh, okay. Brooks already. Well done, Brooke.
Jack?
Yeah, you're right.
Oh, what was that?
Sorry?
Oh, Jack was going to say each are different, and Francine says 1.5.
Yeah. All of those are good answers. Yeah, so normally when I ask that question, people will be like, well, you should put it like an inch deep, or it should be, it's like this kind of rigid, there's no rigid rule on how deep to plant a seed, but there's that rule of thumb, so that around twice as deep as they are big, or like 1 to 2 times as deep as they are big. And so if we go back and we remember what a seed is, it has that, it can feel the quality of light that's hitting the seed coat. It can feel, it only has a certain amount of energy stored up inside of it. So if you plant it too deep, then it's not going to have those light receptors on its seed coat tell it that it's in good conditions to sprout. And even if it did sprout for some reason, there's a good chance it could run out of energy before it's able to make it to the surface, produce leaves, and start to make its own energy. So if you go too deep, then they won't germinate, or they'll die before they can reach the surface. So yeah, it's a good rule of thumb from 2 to 1 times as deep as they are big. And yeah, so all seeds are different sizes, and so that's kind of the rule of thumb that works quite well. I've found times where I've planted seeds too shallow. They don't get enough anchor with their little root system, and they can get washed out a little bit in watering. And so yeah, so that's kind of like the nice kind of depth to have them at. I would say as a caveat, I've found I prefer to plant lettuce seeds on the more shallow side than I would on the deep side. That's been the one thing I've noticed as an exception, or just like a little extra heads up. And so filling a tray might seem kind of straightforward, but I'll go over that really quickly. Is if you can have a potting area outside where you're not going to get your house dirty, that's ideal. But if not, putting down like a poly drop sheet in order to catch that mess is a nice little tactic. Might help you not make your roommates mad. I was trying not to swear there. So yeah, so drop sheet or outside, and I like to pour it right in the middle and then push the seed starting medium out towards the edges, and that creates less of a mess. The one mistake I've seen new gardeners make when filling trays is that the seed starting mix, we've fluffed it up. There's a lot of air in there, and it's not settled whatsoever. So if you just fill it up once, then once you water it, then those air pockets will lose volume, and you start to lose rooting space. So what I do is I fill it up once, and then I'll just really lightly tap all of them down, so that I make sure that there isn't all this extra airspace there. And then I'll fill it up a second time, and the second time I fill it up, I try to leave like a centimeter or two just shy of that lip, so that when I do go to water them, then if it was all the way full, then the water can just kind of slide off if it's not on a perfectly level table. So like having just like a little bit of a lip will allow for that watering, which we really want to make sure that our watering at this stage is really consistent. So all the cells should get, try to get the most even amount of water for each cell, rather than just kind of doing it super randomly and having these patchiness of dryness and wetness in your trays. Yeah, and then I talked about watch out for these compost or peat mixes that have bigger pieces that might be on top and might limit the ability of your seeds to germinate consistently. And so then bringing it back to that crop reference sheet that I said I'd get back to you on this one. So you want to look at your seed packet, and you want to look at the germ percentage. And so the germ percentage is telling you how many, if you planted 100 of these seeds, how many of them would sprout consistently. And so some crops, like a lot of brassica crops, like this cabbage, they sprout really, really consistently. That's 98%. And so you would just really want to put one per cell. Whereas once you start getting into like parsley or some of the other herbs, though their germination percentages could be down in the 70s. So if you want to, and that's no knock really on the seeds, it's just like that's the species. That's just not all seeds are meant to germinate. Some of them can be duds. So if you see on the seed packet a lower germination percentage, which they test before they put them out, then you would want to put like maybe 3 or 4 into that to make sure that you're making an efficient use of space of that tray in your starting area. And then if you're in the 80s, maybe just 2, play with it. You can do whatever you want, but that's my recommendation. And yeah. So as another kind of thing that I like to do in order to make your life easier, well, the seeds are in the process of germinating, but they haven't poked up out of the soil, is to use some of these domes, these clear domes. They keep the evaporation, they lower the evaporation, they keep it humid. And so, yeah, if you're like pretty much all of us and you're busy working your job, and you're trying to do some gardening on the side, then this is another tool that'll make your life easier and increase the odds of success because the soil medium is less likely to dry out. But as soon as they do germinate, we want to take those domes off and away, because these domes would encourage stale, moist air around the stems of these very vulnerable little seedlings. And so if you have stale, moist air around the stems, you're going to tend to get this pattern happen. This is what we call dampening off. It's a fungal infection. And so once they sprout, take the domes off. It's actually really nice to have like a desk fan or have like a nice flow of air going around that soil surface and around those stems and keep them healthy. Otherwise, you could run into this problem, or you're most likely to run into this problem. So there's some home gardening remedies for this. There's some people that sprinkle cinnamon on the soil because it's an antimicrobial, and they say that decreases the chances of this dampening off issue. And yeah, I've heard a couple other things like that. So if you're interested in trying something like that, I say go for it. But honestly, in my experience, I did have a couple of seedlings that this happened to in my first year. But ever since I learned that, like I read that in a book, and then again, the plants taught me the real lesson, and I saw it, and I never made that mistake again. And so good airflow around is going to solve that, but also high quality compost. We were talking about last class about how if the beneficials microbes are way outnumbering the pathogenic, the harmful ones, then the chances of you running into these problems are much lower. So another reason why to use good compost. And
oh, sorry. Can I
yep.
put a question in the chat? What do you do when some of your seeds have sprouted but not others?
Yeah, I mean, if in terms of like the light and the domes. I think that's what she's talking about.
Yeah. Lisa, feel free if you want to unmute yourself to elaborate. Or maybe not.
Regardless, it's kind of a judgment call. Yeah, it's kind of a judgment call. Sometimes if a couple have sprouted and I haven't seen any signs of like the majority of them sprouting, then yeah, I think I would keep the dome on. Especially if it's a crop. There was one year where I started tomatoes in the high school green room, and I had a couple tomatoes sprout in the tray, and I was like, okay, I got to take the dome off. But then we had a couple really cool nights, and the rest of the tomato seedlings that were slower, because I didn't have the dome on, it wasn't holding in the heat on that night, and they were getting the cold air, and I think that affected the germination. So really hard to say for sure like what you would do. Just try to be aware of all the other kind of surrounding factors that might impact that, is what I would say. um, yeah, I already talked about lights, but now I'm realizing I forgot to point out that um, the setup that I have for the lights is they're on chains, and then there's hooks on the light stands, and so I can lower and 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 heighten the chains or the height of the lights. They should ideally be about 4 inches away from the top of your seedlings. If they get too close, they could burn them. But if they get too far away, like they're powerful lights, but they're still nowhere near as powerful as the sun. So it's around 4 inches is what you're looking for there for the distance for the lights. Sometimes, yeah. All right. Yeah, we already talked about the difference between the cotyledon stage, the false leaves, and the true leaves. Generally, when we see that tradition from the false leaves to the true leaves, that's a sign they don't need that supplemental light anymore, and they can just get normal light because they have bigger and more photosynthesis solar panels. And then it's not a perfect rule, but I've generally found that those greenhouse days that you see on that crop reference sheet, they correlate with how many days it takes for the plants to get to the true leaf stage. And so that's when you'll start to see the root systems hitting the side of your cells and seeing some stress going on in the older leaves. So yeah, this is a picture of what it looks like when they get leggy and they're worried they're not getting enough light. And this is a pretty good picture of some seedlings that are nice and stout. And that's what we want our seedlings to be, nice and stout, putting their energy in their root system. And then this is another classic mistake that a new gardener is prone to make, is the hardening off of the plants. When we start seeds indoors, they are in just perfect growing conditions. We're trying to make the most perfect growing conditions we possibly can for them so that they have success as seedlings. But there's a big difference between the indoor conditions and the outdoor conditions. And so if you were to start seeds indoors for like a month, and then you take them out and you leave them outside for an entire day, then this is what a sunburn looks like for a plant. They can actually get burnt from the UV radiation because they have never experienced it before, and they haven't created the biochemical sort of sunscreen to protect themselves. So if you start seeds indoors and you put them out all one day and expose them to the elements, they're going to get stressed. Chances are, if they don't die, then they won't be productive plants like they should be. So there's this concept called hardening off. And that means to slowly acclimatize your plants that you've started indoors and get them used to the outdoors. And so what that looks like is if they've been indoors for over a mow, then they're very, very sensitive. I would put them out for about half an hour the first day and then bring them in. And then day 2 goes out for an hour and then bring them in. And then day 3 out for 2 hours and then bring them in. Day 4 is 4 hours. So slowly getting them used to it and not giving them this complete shock. So that's hardening off. Hello? Jack, your mic's on. Thank you. So yeah, this is just a mistake. I've seen people kind of tell me that they've gone into Calgary, they've gone to some fancy greenhouse, probably dropped $100, $200 on these new plant starts, and they brought them back home and they put them outdoors, and they died, and they can't figure it out, and they just blame themselves for not having a green thumb. And the fact of the matter is, it's not that they don't have a green thumb, they just didn't know about this small little caveat to slowly getting plants used to being outdoors. So something to look out for. I know that process, that hardening off process that I explained, is pretty, sounds laborious. So there are ways of getting around that. If you're growing a more cold hardy crop like kale or cabbage or something like that, that can deal with cooler temperatures, then I like to, for those ones, I like to, the earlier in their life you expose them to those elements, the faster they adapt. So if you have those cooler tolerant crops, getting them out on maybe not a day like today, that today was cold, but if it's like 12 to 15 degrees, maybe even 10 degrees, and you have some seedlings that have just sprouted, the sooner you get them out there, the faster they adapt and the less you have to baby them. But if they're tomatoes or cucumbers or something like that, then chances are, because they're frost sensitive and all that, the process can be a little bit much. And then you can do things where like you can use covers, or you can kind of partially shade them, or you can kind of put like a wicker basket over them and leave them out for longer. And because they have a little bit of protection from those elements, then, rather than the first day being half an hour, then the first day might be more like an hour and a half. And then the next day can be 3 hours, so you can speed it up, but speed up with caution, because you don't want to hurt your plants, or you want to try to avoid it as best you can. And then this is a good look at what happens when they stay in their containers for too long. This is root circling. You can see really well there. That's been in way too long. If you have a potted plant like that and you want to repot it or put it out, then you'd rough up those roots, and otherwise it kind of chokes itself out. So you kind of rip them apart and rough them up, and it'd be a stressful experience for that plant, but it's what they need at that point. And then if you look over here, you look at these yellow oldest cotyledon leaves. Those aren't even old cotyledon leaves, but they are the oldest leaves on those plants. And so that is a sure sign. As soon as you start to see the older leaves on your plant starting to yellow and maybe get some red in there, then you got to move them. You got to plant them out. You got to move them to a bigger container, or else they're just going to get root bound like this.
Jack has a question for you, Christian.
Yep.
When you're hardening off, is it about sunshine or is it about temperature that you're hardening to?
I mean, when you're hardening off, temperature-wise, to put them out for an extended period of time, there's like this point, this temperature point where below 12 degrees, their growing rates are significantly slower than when they're above. So that's something to consider when you're hardening off. is that if it's 12 degrees or higher, then that's a very favorable temperature to start getting them out there. In terms of cloud cover, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because if it was my first time taking some seedlings out, let's say it's 13 degrees, so we're good there. It's cloudy out. Then maybe I would leave them, instead of that half an hour that I would put them out for if it was a sunny day, maybe I put them out for 45 minutes, maybe even an hour, because the ultraviolet radiation is a little bit lower. And so you can gain an advantage in that step. But you got to be conscious of them and not forget them. Maybe set a timer on your phone or something like that. So good question,
I'm kind
Jack.
of curious.
Did I answer you?
Is if say you had them plants in a porch area that you're keeping warm, and
Yep.
and you got a good window, but you don't want to
Yep.
carry your plants out, that the porch is contained, you could open the window in the evening for 2 hours the first day, and then but there's no sun, at 9 o'clock at night it gets cooler.
Yeah.
To cool that porch down to 16 degrees the first night, then 15, then 14. Will that still be just as good without taking them outside?
Yeah, if you have that window, that's a really nice design solution to a somewhat laborious task, is to be able to open that window in a morning or a night situation where the angle of the sun is much lower, and so that radiation isn't as intense as if you were trying to do that at 1 o'clock. Yeah, that's kind of a different dynamic, and they can stay out longer in that situation without starting to stress. So that's a good point.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
And we have another question in the chat from Mary. Once plants are hardened, transplant them in the evening. Oh, so they have all night to acclimate. More of a comment.
Oh, sorry. Once they've hardened off.
Yeah. Once plants are hardened off, transplant them in the evening so they have all night to acclimate.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you. So then the next one here is in the situations where you would plant more than one seed per cell, because of that germination percentage, you might need to thin those cells out so that the roots of those plants aren't germinating, or they're not competing with each other for nutrients. So originally, you start more than one seed per cell in order to make sure you have efficiency in your space. But once they sprout, then you have to start identifying which of those seedlings looks the most favorable for you, which is the stoutest, which is looking the glossiest, the happiest, the most vigorous. And you want to keep that one, and then you'd want to kind of pull out the other one. And the way I like to do that is a butter knife. Is if you have two little seedlings growing really close to each other, then I'll kind of use the butter knife to separate the two, so that when I pull the other one, then I have a better chance of not tugging on the leaf of the healthy one. And I kind of press the knife to the soil just gently, so that as I pull that root up, the root that's staying isn't as disturbed. So that's just a little thing to consider for those crops that we start closer to each other. Trying to get my cursor, trying to get the click. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so there are some crops like tomatoes and peppers that because they're so frost sensitive and because they have long greenhouse days, then about halfway through those greenhouse days, in the original container that you start them in, they'll start to run out of space. And so you need to a bigger container. This is a 4-inch pot that I use a lot of these for. And so that's a way to keep them growing on without stressing them, and making sure that they keep going, and they'll be ready to get transplanted out in the right way. Can you hear me? Because my computer just said my connection is unstable.
You're cutting in and out a bit.
That's good.
Yeah. Hopefully it hangs in there.
Okay. So these are the steps that I like to do when potting up. I like to pre-soak the seedlings, the seedling plugs that I started in here before I move them. And I also like to fill the pots in the same way that I do the trays originally. I'll fill them once and then push them down a little bit and then fill them a second time, although not quite as deep, because the plugs, the soil plugs for these, take up more volume. But yeah, so I like to fill these and water them down, because it just makes the transfer a lot easier. The soil plugs stay together. There's more cohesion with soil than if they're all dried out for this. So it just makes life easier there. And then you want to water the soil that they're going to go into, because if they go into like super dry soil, then it like dries out their roots and it sends them into shock. So kind of easing that transition for them is really good. And then for this, I've always just used, I like to use a butter knife for this again. I've seen people kind of squeeze the bottom of these, but I mean, I like to get as many seasons out of these as possible. So like just breaking up the bottom of your tray is going to be expensive, and it turns multiple use plastic into single use, which isn't great. So what I do is I just kind of like go down the sides with the knife and I just kind of wedge them up. I might go from multiple angles and I just try to encourage them to come up. I might be on the other side with my finger, like just pinching the stem very, very gently and trying to get them up. And so that's how I move them. Like to be in the most ergonomic position possible, so I'm not bent over in a garden doing it, making my back sore, but you should be sitting in a comfortable position. And then when you transfer them into the new pot with the new soil, most plants, you want to maintain the same soil level for the new, when you put them in, you want to firm down the soil and maintain that same soil level on the stem. You don't want to pile soil up, because that can run you into some fungal infections. But the caveat there is the tomatoes, which have those adventitious roots, which are originally trichomes, but they'll turn into a bigger root system. So those you can pile up soil around, and that's a favorable thing. Same with leeks, we talked about that. And yeah, some people I've seen make the mistake where when they transfer seedlings like this into a new soil medium, they're afraid to push down and firm the soil. You don't want to compact it. You don't want to jam it down there, but you do want to make sure that that root ball underneath feels that soil medium underneath, rather than air pockets, and is encouraged to grow down and start to colonize that new soil. And then after that, I'll give them another watering. That they can show signs of stress and shock. They might fall over, but just hang with them. Just give them some more water, and they should recover. There's going to be always like some level of transplant shock, but our job is just to try to make that shock as relaxing as it quite possibly could be. And then, so when we transplant out, same similar kind of thing where we want to make sure that the bed space, the soil in the bed space that we're going to plant into is not totally dry. So it's nice to water that before, but not right before. I find like if you do it right before, then it's muddy and it sticks to your fingers and it makes working with it really hard. So doing it around half an hour before lets that water kind of infiltrate in, and it's evenly kind of wicks into the soil, and it's better to work with. And then same thing when you're trying to pull them out. If you water those seedlings half an hour before, then it makes the popping out process a lot easier. So yeah, I like to get the bed ready before. I'll talk about bed prepping in the next slide, I think, but I guess I didn't have the perfect sequential here. But when we're going to plant them out into the garden, then you would look at the right row density and then the in-row density that you will want to plant them on in the crop reference chart or in the seed packet if you like. And I like to just put down a tape measure and pre-mark those spots. And then I'll pop them all out, and I'll put them all in those pre-marked spots, and then I'll go back and I'll pop them into the soil. I like to use like a diamond pattern for planting rather than having them all at the same level within the row. So if they're 1 foot apart, if there's 3 rows and they're supposed to go 1 foot apart, I would rather the middle row be at 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, or I should say 1 inch, 12 inch, 24 inch, 36 inch, and then the 2 outside rows would go at 6, 18, 30, 42. And so that kind of creates like this diamond pattern within them rather than being straight across, and that just makes more rooting space available for the neighboring plant, a little bit less competition in the roots. Yeah, so I kind of pop them out. I'll find a nice comfortable place to be sitting, pop them out, put them into trays, and then take them out into the garden. But you don't want the root systems to be exposed to the sun and the elements for too long. So I'll just pop out maybe like 12 at a time and do those, and then come back and pop out another 12. And so that, from the point of view of the plants, their root systems aren't above the soil, which is very unnatural for them for a long time. And then also it's kind of this thing, my friend Willis, who's a really good farmer in just Biosoyuz, he talked to me about engineered inefficiencies. And so like, yeah, we want to be fast in what we're doing with in the garden, but sometimes if we only do 12 transplants at a time, then that gets me up out of that potentially awkward position that I was in, and I can walk back and stretch out my back and loosen up. And it's just it might not be as fast as some people like, but I recommend kind of engineering some inefficiencies just for the sake of your body feeling good. And then, yes.
Oh, sorry, Christian. Do you want, okay. Yeah. Jack had a question. When potting up, how do you know when to pot it into a bigger pot?
It would be, there is, I think we'll go back to, if you look at the transplant reference chart, for those crops that generally need that potting up, there's like a little star next to their greenhouse days. And so that directs you to the bottom of the chart that tells you that that's one of the ones that needs potting up. But also it would be the plant would be telling you by having a little bit of discoloration, some yellowing coming in on the old leaves would start to be showing. Like when you see yellowing in the oldest leaves, that's the telltale sign that the root system is either cramped or it doesn't have enough nutrients. So that would be like, okay, I gotta get them some more space to grow in, or give them more nutrients. Yeah, so then you just want to pop them in at the right density, as you can see in the reference chart that I already covered. You want to firm that soil down. Again, make sure that the soil isn't coming up on the stem unless it's like your tomato or your leek like we talked about. I have heard some people say that, and I don't think it applies to us, like some people have suggested that sometimes planting them a little bit proud of the soil, for some things like lettuce that are um, prone to bacterial wilt disease from not having enough airflow around those bottom leaves, then having that plug go into the soil and being just like a little bit above it can encourage that airflow. But I've found that we have such a humid environment here, or atmosphere here in the Rockies, that I haven't had much bacterial wilt problems. So. Yeah, you can see here, for Jack's question. Oh yeah, it's in the tray size. So you can see 72 asterisk D, and you go down tray size to pot up to. Or yeah, yeah. So anytime you see those, and anytime you see the PU, those are the ones that are correlated with the greenhouse days, that you know about halfway into that, you should be looking to give them more space for their root system.
Mary has a question. If the roots seem really compacted, can you score the bound root ball to encourage them to widen out and not keep circling as root bound?
Yeah. That's what I kind of meant by roughing them up. Is, yeah, you could kind of break that root ball up and encourage them to spread out again. But that should be worst case scenario. If you're aware of those signs of the leaves showing stress on the oldest leaves, and if you're familiar with using that tool with the greenhouse days, you shouldn't have to deal with that. So my next slide is just talking a little bit about how I like to prep beds for direct seeding. And so we've talked about how when we cause a disturbance to the soil, that can cause problems, so we want to try to create that disturbance. We want to minimize that disturbance and understand that it's a planned one. And so these are the tools that I like to use to minimize that and to understand how to plan that disturbance rather than just to do it unthinkingly. So if I were to prep a bed in order to plant it for direct seed that week, then I would put in my garden schedule 2 or 3 weeks down the road to want to weed that bed. By 2 or 3 weeks down the road, then the targeted crop that I want to grow will be coming up, and they'll be in nice straight lines, and I'll be able to see them really clearly. And then there will be some weed seeds that were mixed in there, and so they'll have sprouted up as well. And so if I put that in the plan to pull those those little opportunists at that point, then again, they're in the cotyledon stage. They're so small that picking them out of the soil is just really, really easy. It's really quick work, rather than letting them get established, letting them get that energy in there. And that's when we start to hate on weeding. So consider that. And then the other really good technique that I want to recommend to people has to do with these silage or occultation tarps. And so these, I know they don't look really nice, but they are really effective if you were to prep a bed like I'm about to explain, and then if you were to prep a bed like 2 weeks before you were going to plant it, and then put one of these on, then all those weed seeds that were brought to the surface, then you're creating like nice moist conditions, but the occultation tarp blocks out all the sunlight from getting through. They're UV protected. So it's a stale seedbed technique that we trick all those weed seeds to germinate, and then they die. And then 2 weeks later, we have like a pretty much pristine bed to plant in. And just that little bit of work will save a lot of work in the long run, just knowing that kind of relationship between prepping a bed, bringing the weed seeds to the top, but denying them the ability to make their own energy. And now we're off and running, and that's less grunt work down the road. So I like to leave the crop residue from the previous year or the straw that I've mulched with. I'll actually put these silage tarps on the beds over the winter in order to prevent any established weeds from getting strong. So I would pull the silage tarp off, and I would rake back that residue, and I'd go through it with one of these ground forks for a direct seeded bed. I would probably almost always use one of these. And so they are just like a really ergonomic tool that it's creating this disturbance for us. But so it's creating a disturbance, it's decompacting the soil, and it's aerating the soil just a little bit. But this is a tool that I would recommend using rather than what people used to do is double dig the soil or take a big rototiller and spin all that soil up. And the rototiller or the double dig just destroys all that really valuable soil structure that I talked about last class. And it shreds up all the fungal hyphae in there, and it kills the worms, whereas this gets the right amount of disturbance, but it doesn't shred everything to pieces. So it's really, really good to keep those soil horizons that we want to keep intact and not shred. It just does the right amount of work in a very ergonomic way. You don't even have to bend your back. You're just kind of putting the tines on the top of the soil, and you're stepping down, and you pull back a little bit, and you give a little wiggle, and then you go back 6 inches, 4 inches, and you do it again. And it's just a great tool from that soil structure and soil food web point of view, and then from the ergonomic working point of view of your back. You can find these at a lot of seed websites. They run about $220. If you're not interested in investing in one of those, or if you're not growing in the ground and you have containers, then a ground fork like this is that's a good option as well. It pretty much does the same thing. Is you're just sticking it in the soil, just wiggle it a little bit, and it decompacts, it oxygenates, doesn't hyperoxygenate, but it's perfect. So after I broad fork, then I would add whatever amendments that I'd be looking to do. And again, this is for direct seeding crops. Then I would mix them in with mix those amendments in. And so this is the tool that I've been using for the last several years. It's called a tilder. Its tines are only go 4 inches deep. So it mixes those amendments in to the most superficial layer, and it creates a very, very fine particle seed bed, which when you are starting direct seeds or smaller seeds in a direct seeded fashion, the more surface area you have around those seeds, the better they'll germinate. Whereas if you still have like the larger soil structure aggregates that we like lower down in the soil, if they're still like have bigger clumps, then when you water them, again, it's kind of like planting seeds too shallow. They have trouble like rooting in. So this is the one time where I like to really disturb the soil. But even in that disturbance of that soil, I've minimized it by using these two really great tools, or that and that, in order to work. I'll take a landscape rake or a hard rake, and I'll rake that bed out as evenly as possible, trying to avoid any dips or valleys, because when we start direct seeded crops, if your bed that you've prepared has all these tiny little hills, valleys, then when you water it, once you've planted it and you water it, then the water is going to flow to the low parts and wick away from the high parts. And that's going to give, once those seeds do start to germinate, the seedlings that do come through on the higher parts are going to be weaker and spindlier and not as healthy looking and as the ones on the low parts. So it's all about making the most consistent bed possible for that. And then, yeah, so we're carrying on with direct seeding now. So you would want to look on the crop reference sheet or your seed packet in order to find how far away the rows are going to be. And so as you can, if you prep it in the way that I was talking about and getting a nice fine bed, then there's this little trick. Once you know the spacing that you need between the rows, there's this trick that I heard from one of the best farmers, small-scale farmers, Jean-Martin Fortier. He talks about this rake trick, where if you look at a hard rake, not like a soft rake that you would use for raking up fall leaves, but like a hard rake with hard metal prongs, each one of those prongs are 1 inch apart. And so if your spacing between rows is 6 inches, then you can take, oh, I forgot to bring it. You can just cut up like little rubber tubing and put it on the end of the rake prong, and then count to 6 and put another one there, and then count to 6 and put another one there. And then you just run the rake all the way down the bed, and you make like these perfectly distanced rows that are like a really good furrow depth to put the seed in. And I've had people walk by the garden and actually ask me what machine I use to make the rows so perfectly even distance apart from each other. And the joke is that it's just like 10 cents worth of rubber tubing on a rake. So I hope you guys like that one. And then you would want to look up the in-row density on the crop reference sheet in order to get an idea of how far apart in row you would want to put them. So look up that. And then you can figure out how many seeds you'll need to plant the space that you want to by going, okay, I need to plant 2 meters of a bed space, and I have 3 rows in the bed. So I would go 2 times 3 equals 6 times the seeds per meter, which this seed rate, I haven't actually showed you that one. Where is that? Yeah, here's our direct seed. This is like the transplant crop reference, but for direct seeded. And so the last part of that calculation is here, the seed rate. So let's say hypothetically, probably because my math won't be that good, let's go with carrots are 100 seeds per meter, right? And so that's different for all of them. Let's go back to this calculation. So 2 meters times 3 rows equals 6. And then times 100 is telling you that in order to seed at the right density for that space, you would need 600 carrot seeds, but nobody's going to sit around and count 600 carrot seeds. That's ridiculous. So if you have a scale, then you can look up the seeds per gram on this. No, that's transplanted. Yeah, seeds per gram for carrots, and it is 640. And now my math is really gonna. Somebody want to calculate that? No, no takers. All right, fine, I'll do it myself. 2 times 3 is 6. 600. 600 times 640, or actually, sorry, divided by 640 tells you how many grams of carrot seeds you would need. So you just weigh that out, find the grams, and then you'll know as you're seeding it, if you're seeding it too close, then you're gonna have to thin it out. But yeah, so that's a neat little trick that should be helpful for people. And then obviously you place them in the rows. I like to keep the furrows open until I'm totally done to make sure that we haven't missed any section. Maybe that's because I'm used to working with grade 4s that are all really excited and don't pay attention to the details. But yeah, I think it's helpful to keep the furrows open. And then if it's a smaller seeded crop, then I would just turn over my landscape rake and drag it back over the bed really evenly, and that just closes the furrows. But sometimes, and especially with little kids, we would just kind of like close the furrows up over. And again, you're trying to go for about 1 to 2 times the depth of how big the seeds are. After that, I like to water really, really thoroughly, but you have to water carefully at this point, because when you've prepared a seed bed in this way, when you've disturbed the soil and you've taken it from being larger aggregates into like this fine grain, if you sit there and water one section, then it'll infiltrate to a certain point. But after that, you'll start to get surface water runoff that starts to turn into channelized flow, which starts to erode away your bed. And all that hard work of making the most flat seed bed as possible, you lose that to like that, all that fine soil particles just getting picked up by that water and moved in whichever direction gravity decides to move it in. So be careful of that. I like to water really, really thoroughly when I start, but I'll wait for that water to infiltrate before I'll add it again. And then you might want to consider adding a mulch on top of that. And most of the time the seedlings can grow right through that mulch, whether it's straw or maybe it's grass clippings or something like that. This would be the time to add that mulch. But sometimes, like for example, for directly seeded baby lettuce, which is like 5 or 6 rows per standard bed, and then 180 seeds per meter. So a lot of seeds there. You really wouldn't want to mulch at all. I really recommend this floating row cover, also called rime. It's like this lightweight fabric, this white fabric that you can put over your beds. And that protects the soil. So that's kind of like this artificial mulch that will protect the soil while the seedlings are getting established. The rime row cover is also really, really important from the standpoint of it creates a little bit of a greenhouse effect in the nighttime temperatures. So the soil is warmer during the day, and at night it's trying to escape, but this fabric kind of keeps it a little bit warmer. So that helps germination go faster and more consistently. And then it also decreases evaporation from the soil. So there's a similar pattern here when direct seeding as when starting when being transplanting is you have to have a fairly rigid watering schedule during this germination stage. If you let that soil dry out, oh, you can see some remay fabric back there on some beds there. So I have a very rigid watering schedule for any beds that were direct seeded and in the process of germinating. I would water at 11 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and then at night again. We don't want it to dry out. So that fabric really, really helps really well. It keeps that evaporation rate a lot lower. And if you're, as I'm sure a lot of people out there are busy, you're away at jobs during the day and you can't get back to water like that, then you would either try to get another family member or a friend to help you out with that watering schedule, or you would double down on these row cover in order to decrease that potential for evaporation, and that's going to increase your chances of success. Okay, we're coming up on 2 hours, eh? Maybe this is the last slide for today, and then we'll pick it up again on Monday. My voice box is hurting at this point. So, yeah, like I said already, you want to use that extra caution to avoid that water, that erosion effect on that newly disturbed soil. So beware of that. And then I like to say water like a metronome. Like if you're watering something, especially like a smaller establishing crop or like a germinating seed bed, I will like all my steps is like I'm watering like I'm a metronome. I'm not speeding up or slowing down. I'm looking at the edges where the watering can is hitting them and trying to get things as even as possible. Whereas again, like I see some people when they start watering a garden, like it's kind of a romantic thing for people and I get it, but they're watering like they're holding their lover's hand on a long walk in the beach and they're just swinging the watering can and you just have patches of like well-watered bed and then like absolutely dry. And so I like that people are kind of enjoying themselves and swinging it around, but that's not practical from a seed starting point of view. So water like a metronome, please. And then there's an ideal time of day to do the watering. Obviously, the establishing phase, like I said, is more rigorous. But once they get established, the best time of day to water is when your shadow is around as twice as big as you are tall. So you don't really want to water in the middle of the day because the sun angle is so high, it makes evaporation very, very high. And so that's not favorable. It's not an efficient use of water. But you don't want to water at night either necessarily because, well, if you're watering overhead, then you'll have this water sitting on the leaves and that can contribute to some fungal issues and some bacterial issues. Standing water on leaves is not a good pattern to do. So when your shadow is around twice as tall as you are big, then there's still enough light in the sky either in the morning or in the evening for that sun to kind of evaporate the water off the leaves, and you have a healthy pattern there, but it's not evaporating the water that's reaching the soil and making it no bueno. And then I said quality over frequency. It's better to water every couple of days. If you're in a drought situation and where there's no soil moisture, then I would rather water every couple days very thoroughly and percolate that water deeper down into that soil in order to encourage the roots to go deeper down, rather than if you water every day just a little bit, then that water is just at a very superficial layer, horizon of the soil. and that's not a very healthy pattern for plants. We want to get them going deeper down to where the soil is, or sorry, where the water is. Yeah, so then I guess the one exception to that is for lettuce. Lettuce will get bitter if it doesn't get watered really well. So if you're growing lettuce, don't be stingy with the water. If it's growing in dry conditions, then eventually your salad is going to be bitter and you're not going to enjoy it as much. And my last advice here is there's this saying in permaculture called you got to get black and blue before you get green. And what that means is you have to figure out a really good fertility program for your garden. And you have to make sure you can figure out a really good watering system, an efficient way to get that water out into your garden so that you're not doing any extra just mindless labor. So figuring out those two, your soil and your watering system, your irrigation system, is really important before you start growing. Otherwise, it can be a lot of grunt work. And that's why I put this picture from my first year at Lawrence Grassy. I had not figured out an efficient watering system, and that was me watering by hand like an idiot. It's a nice picture, but that was a lot of unnecessary work because I didn't put a really good thought into the irrigation system and really make it efficient. It made my work very inefficient. And so I'll leave you off. I really recommend anybody out there check out the Verge Permaculture. Their YouTube channel has a lot of great water design systems that I wouldn't have time to explain them in the right, do justice to them. And Rob and Michelle, not just like their rainwater collection, but all their videos on their channel are really, really great. I recommend checking them out. That's it. That's it, you guys.
Awesome. Have a big drink of water and take a breath, and then we might have some questions here for you. That was awesome. It's gotten me so excited to get my seed started, and yeah, can't wait for Monday night. So Bridget has a question. Is your watering all automatic now?
It is 90% automatic. Yeah. Yeah, there was some that I haven't automatized. Just it's tough for actually dense, quick growing greens like this was a little bit harder to create. Everything's basically on drip and automatic, but I found that the drip didn't work as well for these beds of intense greens. So I do turn on a sprinkler for those.
Awesome. Any other questions? We got lots of thanks in the chat. Everyone was really, really pumped on this one, Christian. So thanks. Yeah,
thanks, everybody.
Feel free to unmute yourself. Or what are you going to talk about on Monday night, Christian?
Okay, Monday night, I guess I have some slides from this presentation to polish off. And then after that, I'm going to talk about this concept of plant partitioning and crop steering. And once I started to wrap my mind around that, it helped me manage a lot. I think everybody, that's going to be like this thing that's really going to tie a lot of this conversation together. So I'll be talking about that, and then try to get into like a little bit of a seed saving. And I guess if people want to write down questions that I haven't answered yet to make sure that I hit on, I mean, it's our last class, so feel free, anybody out there, to, if you could write those down and send them our way, so I can make sure to really answer them as quality as possible. That'd be great.
Yeah, I can remind everybody in my email out just to, yeah, send me any questions, and then, yeah, you'll be ready.
I'll be talking about pruning to the best of my ability too.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everybody again for tuning in, and thanks Christian for sharing your knowledge with us, and we'll see you on Monday.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye. Take care.